Hello all, welcome back again. Today the theme is disability and ethnography. So far we have been exploring various interdisciplinary aspects of disability, and today is ethnography. I am a literary critic, so I don't have much clue about ethnography, although I know a little bit about it. Today we have with us Professor James Staples. He has done extensive, I repeat that again, extensive field work in South India. He knows a couple of Indian languages. He has, he has been here for last 20 years or so. Coming and going doing ethnographic work. And what kind of work? He wrote a very important book, which I'm reading almost to the finish. It's called Leprosy and a Life in South India, Journeys with a Tamil Brahmin. So, and apart from leprosy, he's interested in embodied aspects of Indian life, which may include caste, religion, food habits, customs, and many more. So, welcome James to the studio here or via Skype. So, to begin with, shall we talk about your training as an anthropologist?
And my training, yes. Well, yeah. Thank you. It's good to be here and to speak to you, Hem. My training as an anthropologist, I guess. I did an undergraduate degree in anthropology at SOAS, at the School of Oriental and African Studies, which was back in the late 80s, which I was drawn to in a way because I'd spent some time in India already. I already had this connection with the leprosy colony, where I eventually carried out my PhD field work. So I felt that doing a degree in anthropology would allow me to continue to pursue this kind of interest in India and to be able to spend more time there, which it did. So I did some very preliminary field work during that first undergraduate degree. I think I got to spend about 3 months, an additional 3 months in that leprosy colony. And then I went to do my PhD probably about 10 years later. I worked for some time in journalism and in other fields. Still visited India periodically to visit the people that I'd formed relationships with. And then I studied a PhD at SOAS back in 1998, I think it was, between 98 and 2003. And again, the training, there was some, I was trying to think if we did any, most of the training in terms of language training, for example, I had to do in situ because I couldn't really find anybody close to where I lived in the UK who could teach me Telugu. I knew some Telugu already, but I wanted to get better. So most of the training, I guess, was during that period. It was about one year, I think just over 1 year of fieldwork in South India, back in that community again, where I carried out my ethnographic study, where I had an hour or two every morning spent with a Telugu teacher, trying to pick up the language. I don't think my grammar improved very much, actually, but I did learn more vocabulary so that I could communicate and so I could better understand the things people were telling me. Back at SOAS, I think the initial training was we would have a seminar, I remember, every Monday morning with a professor who would talk about various kinds of techniques that we might use in the field, but he would also talk about things like doing archival research, how we might use texts and so on, ways of finding out the kinds of things that we might want to know. We also had a student-led seminar called, I think, Ethnography at the Third Millennium. So it was a very postmodern kind of thing. It was student-led. We invited different speakers in to come in and discuss different kinds of topics that concerned us, whether they were about ethics, the problems of being, British scholars, going to work in other countries which had been colonies of Britain in the past, and the problems of power and so on that those things threw up. It was about learning to be reflexive, about learning to listen to people when they're talking to you, learning how to engage in people, really to find out what their perspectives are, rather than simply imposing a hypothesis on people and then getting them to confirm it, which is, I think, what happens sometimes, at least in caricatures of the natural sciences. How true that is in reality, I don't know. But certainly it was something that we wanted to guard against very much.
Yeah.
And then I went to, did my year's field work, came back, and then you have that kind of lonely experience, having been very much embedded, as I was, in village life for an entire year. An incredibly social time. You were continuously engaging with other people. To then suddenly be cast back to working at a computer in the corner of your bedroom or in the library, trying to write this stuff, put it into words, and to make sense of it. And I think we did have, in fact, we did have a writing seminar where we could share our work. I think once every couple of weeks or so. But it was, I suppose, it was about reconnecting the reading and the other things that you've done in that first year of the PhD, and to connect it with the very empirical kind of work that you did during ethnographic field work, and then trying to make sense of it and to write it up. So I guess that was the main body of the training. Of course, I also had a PhD supervisor, Professor David Moss, who was, I remember, very helpful, who read endless drafts of things that I churned out, who I'd spend an hour with every couple of weeks or so, who would he'd critique the things that I wrote, would challenge me on the things that I said, and which hopefully set the groundwork for the work that I did subsequently. I don't know if that answers your question.
Of course, yes. Now I was coming to the point about your interest in India, particularly India of the 1980s.
Yes.
What does that mean, James?
Gosh. Well, I first came to India in 1984, which was kind of an exciting time in many ways to come to India. I knew very little about India, to be honest. I was 18, I'd just left school. I had a friend whose aunt worked in a leprosy colony. She was a nurse. I wanted to go somewhere that was entirely different to anywhere that I'd been before, to move away from my own life in the kind of home counties in the provincial part of the UK, and to experience something entirely different. So in a way, at that point, it didn't matter too much to me whether it was India or somewhere else, but this was where the opportunity arose. So I arrived just as Indira Gandhi had ousted the chief minister of Andhra Pradesh state, I remember. So we were on a train which had rocks held at it and was held up for several hours in a station. So it was a very exciting, very volatile time.
Yes.
Indira Gandhi was assassinated during the time that I was in India. But it was also a time of great change in other ways, which I'm not quite sure, again, if I was aware of it at the time, or now that I do work, or in relation to the work I've done subsequently, that you could see enormous changes that were going on. In the village where I worked, in the leprosy colony where I worked, back in '84, not a single person had a landline. Nobody had a telephone. You had to go several miles if you wanted to make a call outside of the local area. Nobody had a television or a fridge. The electricity was very sporadic. I think it still is, actually.
Yes, it is.
But now lots of people have televisions. Lots of people have those kinds of consumer goods that they didn't have. Plus, although the people who are there are still very poor, they're connected in kinds of different ways, I think, to the outside world, to how they were in the past. You couldn't buy Coca-Cola in those days, which was probably a good thing, but now you can. There are all these different kinds of consumer goods that people can aspire to.
Now it's easy to buy Coke than water.
On Facebook. Sorry?
Now it is easy to buy Coke than water.
Exactly, yes.
Yeah.
As it was before, I suppose in the very early 1980s.
Yes.
In '84, it was very good. It meant you could only have Amul's chocolate or Amul's butter, for example.
I know.
It was kind of a pleasing restriction in terms of the consumer goods that you could buy, at least for me. So it enabled me, I think, to document an enormous kind of period of change in terms of changes from, the relative importance of class, for example, in determining people's status and so on, over caste, and how those two things interacted. Having that very long-term engagement, which I guess now has been 35 years or something, even though I wasn't an anthropologist when I first visited India, I still have relationships with those same people. So there's a way of longitudinally documenting the kinds of changes that have taken place in society over that period.
I think it was also the time of enormous state violence and the emergence of crude forms of religious fundamentalism amidst changing crude economic, if you like, lowdown. And it was such a bad time for India nationally as well as locally for people.
Yeah.
Is that a fair assessment, James?
Yeah, I think that's right, certainly with retrospect. I think at the time in those early visits in the 1980s that I was very much in a way in my own bubble and within the community within which I worked. So it's often only with retrospect that you see those things. The big violence, for example, that was going on between Muslims and Hindus in Hyderabad, for example, which again was something.
And after Indira Gandhi's death, state-induced violence and much more. Actually, it has nothing to do with the party. It's a general characteristic of 1980s and its aftermath.
Yes, absolutely.
I was reading your works and I came across this very nice chapter on leprosy affirmation among the leprosy colony, where the people who inhabit it. It's called "We Are One Caste, One Disease, and One Religion." I'm trying to look at this in terms of religious diversities and their violences in India. In some sense, as an anthropologist, you are looking at the most stigmatized identity for its own ethnography, and in a way, this proves to be a larger commentary on the larger aspects of identity, politics, and much more for the larger spectrum. I want to know more about that. Why did you focus on a particular colony? Is that because it is the most stigmatized identity, or it has larger bearing for you to know about multiple ethnographic fields in India?
It's a good question. In a way, it was based on serendipity, that this was a community that I knew about, where I knew the people, where I knew I could go back, and where there were interesting kinds of transformations taking place, particularly when I did my PhD field work in kind of 1999, 2000, which was also a time when leprosy was supposed to be, on the way out, that they wanted to declare leprosy as being over by the millennium. So, that was part of what drew me there and drew me into that particular kind of field work. I think the other thing, and I suppose this is true for lots of anthropologists, that we tend to do work within a particular small community or a particular small location, or at least with a particular group of people, rather than working at a national or a very large scale level. So I think that was, yes, so certainly working with that particular community enabled me to look at these bigger pan-Indian kind of issues that related, for example, to caste or to religion, and to attitudes towards particular diseases, towards stigma and so on, within the particular experiences of this particular group of people. They were a multi-caste village. People had come from various different kinds of backgrounds to live there. Some were Muslim, most were Christians, although many of those Christians had converted after having been diagnosed with leprosy, had converted from Hinduism to Christianity. So there was still a strong kind of Hindu influence, I think, within the village. I think one other thing that was also important in defining, what makes this particular field, what makes a place, was recognizing that people had all sorts of connections to other places as well. That you can't simply, as I think anthropologists did in the 1950s, thought that if you stayed in a village, the whole of life would essentially pass you by. You could look at anything that happened in India would happen in the village, so you didn't really need to go anywhere else. This was a microcosm of society. And I think that didn't really recognize those kinds of connections that people have with other places, with other people, and it doesn't really recognize the influences that national and international kinds of policies have on particular people. I mean, I think working with leprosy in particular, there were lots of things in the lives of the people I worked with, even if they weren't necessarily aware of it, that were being shaped by national policies, which in turn were being shaped by policies of the World Health Organization and so on and so on. This drive to eliminate leprosy, for example, which was going on at the time. So I think it was important also to recognize those connections, those big kind of international connections, global connections, but also the more localized ones that people had. So, many people in the community where I worked, for example, in this leprosy colony, spent very long periods going begging in Mumbai, or Bombay, as I think it still was when I started my field work. So it was important in doing that field work also to try and travel to the places that the people I worked with traveled to, whether that was going back to their natal villages when they visited relatives, and documenting the kinds of reactions that people had to them within their own communities and so on, whether it was going with them to Mumbai and observing how they lived as they went begging, where they slept, where they ate, how they carried out these activities on a day-to-day basis, who they interacted with, how they learnt about the world in general through interacting with it in these other locations. I think I've drifted some way from your original question. You might want to...
No. Carry on, because this is so fundamental to your book on Job Das. I mean, I would call him that way, Tamil Brahman, how he transforms over a period of time. It's all about the retracing all the steps of transformation. Yes,
I think tracing and retracing steps, is something that's important. I think as an ethnographer, you can't simply sit still. You can't simply come and bring your chair out and put it outside the house and watch life go by. I mean, in the village, you can see quite a lot that way, but you only see a particular snapshot. You don't see what happened before, or you don't see then what's going to happen afterwards, or going to happen in another place. So I think it is important, both, as you say, in terms of understanding history, so across a kind of temporal trajectory, how things change over time, but how things are also changing in the moment and in particular spaces.
Here we need to sort of inform a little more about ethnography for a non-specialist audience like me. I imagine ethnography as a special way of talking or conversing, being and looking. Is that a fair enough description of the idea of ethnography? What is it? What is it? Yeah.
I think that's a very good description, actually. I wish I'd thought of that myself. Yes, it's a good description. I also like Clifford Geertz's description of ethnography, or at least of participant observation, as this deep hanging out, as he calls it.
I like that, deep hanging out.
Yeah. I mean, often people think of it as being something rather simple. It might be looked down upon a bit by people who are doing very rigidly defined experiments that have very specific kind of methodologies that you follow, and then you get the same results every time. I mean, I think ethnography from that perspective can appear to be something that's rather vague. It's simply kind of hanging around, being there, not really doing very much. But as you say, I think it does require attention, particularly to the way you listen to people in ways that perhaps you don't in everyday life. It seems obvious, I guess. That,
you mean with some instrumentality in mind, you mean?
Yeah, well, I think it's important to be as open as possible. So I think, unlike perhaps in some other sciences, we tend not to go into a particular community with a fixed hypothesis. We don't have something already there that we necessarily want to prove. It's about going and finding what's going on, following your nose, following what the people that you're talking to are interested in. So I remember, for example, at one period, I was trying to find out about, what was it? Initially, I thought I could ask questions simply about how people experience leprosy, and I would ask them. And within a leprosy colony, people were not that interested necessarily in talking about that, not in response to direct questions. So you needed to get to those things through other things. It was really important to listen to find out what people were actually interested in within the village, what the local politics were, what were people's everyday kinds of concerns. And to let people talk to you about those things. And I think there's also something very liberating also about doing that kind of field work, in that you don't feel compelled always within a conversation to offer back your opinion or to make a judgment on something. So that whereas, in the past, whereas people I knew, when they would talk, for example, about their evangelical Christianity, which I wasn't necessarily in agreement with all of the things that people were saying. But I discovered that when I actually stepped back, in a sense, and really listened to what they said, I made notes on what they said, I just let them talk, that I actually developed a much, much better understanding of why they thought the way that they did than I had done in the past, rather than simply, as I think is common among our interactions with human beings in our everyday lives, our approach often tends to be about trying to persuade people towards, or more towards, our own worldview, or our own point of view on the world, or explaining to people why they're wrong and why they should think, the way that we do. So I think ethnography has great potential, and in some ways a bit like psychotherapy or something like that, where you listen, you allow people to tell you the things they want to tell you, but you also allow people to work through their own ideas in their own ways. So you also, in a sense, create data in that way. People don't necessarily know that they think in those particular ways about those things until they've articulated them.
Some kind of mirroring, if you like, particularly when you said about psychotherapy, they talk about listening as an act of making yourself available in some sense unconditionally, like a receptacle, or a mirror where they come with their own ideas, bump it on you, and you don't be judgmental, but still listen, and then carry something with you later on.
Definitely, yes. It feels very much like that. And I think, and then the act of writing all this down in great detail, after you've had those conversations, and I think, deep hanging out sounds something that's very easy to do, but actually, it's quite exhausting. I remember there being moments in field work where you thought, please just stop talking. Social life stop happening for a moment so that, I can get to grips with this. I can go off to my room and I can type up these notes. And often you'll be going to my house at 10 o'clock in the evening, and then you'll have 3 or 4 hours of typing things up before they were kind of lost from memory or had been changed by memory. And having that record, having documented all that stuff, enabled you to see patterns actually in the things that people were telling you over time, which you didn't get simply from the individual encounters, or that you wouldn't otherwise have noticed, I think, had you not done that. You started to realize that people had approaches that weren't simply about having one conversation, but by having a series of conversations with you, that they told you something very different that you wouldn't have noticed, I think, had you not had that kind of record keeping going on.
I guess once you have written your notes down, and then when you go back to the field, then it is no more the same, because you have in some sense got a perspective about your field and you got a purpose.
Yes. I mean, yes, I think in subsequent trips, you already go in with certain assumptions, although very often, again, I find those being challenged because people change their
Yes, they do.
on the world and end up telling you very different things the next time.
Yes.
Or their lives have changed in all kinds of ways, which is, again, kind of interesting in itself. But yes, I mean, there is that. And also, I think it's important to recognize that you are also part of that data yourself as the ethnographer. You're not simply a scientist in a white coat, standing on the edge of this social life that's going on, simply observing it. You're also a part of that. You're also part of creating the realities that you record in your field notes and in your subsequent writing.
I think literary kinds like me call it intersubjectivity. Is that right, James?
Yes, I think so. But it was also about, I mean, in a kind of practical way, I mean, in the leprosy colony, when in the 1990s, late 1990s, I was asking people questions about their history and about the history of their community. And I was struck by how familiar some of the things they told me were. And then eventually somebody bought me this leaflet and said, it's all in here, and gave me this leaflet, which was something that I had written for them at their request in the 1980s, which was something that was going to funding agencies to tell their story in a very particular way. It was about presenting them in the best possible way to raise money for particular projects they were running in the community. So in a way, having written this history myself, this history was then being fed back to people. It was the kind of history that people were telling their kids. And then when I came to do field work, this was how history had become. Now, had I not written that leaflet back in the early 1980s, maybe people would have told me different stories about that. So I think in a very real way, you have implications for the places that you work in as an anthropologist, or indeed in any other kind of field as well, actually. You're kind of part of the data that you produce.
Yes, indeed. I think you have a rare affection for life history as a form of writing and doing ethnography. Well, is this due to your special interest in leprosy, or is it something else? What is happening, James?
I think it's probably something else. I mean, I think it's in part to do with having been coming to India for 35 years. So some of the people that I know and who I work with now are people who I've known for the whole of that period. So, I have informants who I work with, or interlocutors, whatever we want to call them. That's another kind of issue. But people who I've worked with, who I've known longer than very good friends that I have back at home. So there are very long kind of relationships. And I've seen transformations, I've seen changes over time, which I think that you don't necessarily get in the kind of snapshot kind of ethnography, where you might stay a year in one place and you're recording what's going on at that time. And I think life history kind of accounts enable you to see how people's lives change over history. Obviously, I guess the clue is in the name of the thing. You also get to talk, you might go back, as I did with Das, my research assistant, whose biography I wrote. We also tried to trace the steps that he had made at various points in his life. So we went back to visit his natal home, the place that he'd come from. We talked to people who were there, who remembered the family and so on. And just being there for him also evoked particular kinds of memories that I think we wouldn't have found or wouldn't have come out had I simply interviewed him, sitting on the steps of my house, as some of our interviews were. It was also, I think, about finding out a broader history. So through one life, through the history of one person's life, I think you could also find out quite a lot about what was going on in the India of that particular time, for example. He had particular memories, for example, of the emergency in the 1970s, which was something that had happened several years before I came to India for the first time. So it wasn't something that I could know about ethnographically in that sense. But it gave a very particular perspective on those kinds of events, and a kind of perspective that you don't necessarily get from history books, because you've got one person's perspective on it, on how it was to live at that particular time. Was it important? In many ways, it wasn't. He wasn't necessarily aware of it, even though there were things happening to him at that time which were a direct result of the emergency, for example. So I think it was for all of those reasons that drew me to it. In his particular case, it was also about finding out things that didn't necessarily make sense, or trying to connect together different stories that he'd told me over the years to see, how this led to that, and so on, and to try to deal in some ways with the kinds of contradictions in things that I was told, which of course it didn't, because all of us are a bundle of contradictions, and all of us say different things at different times, and it's probably a fool's errand to try to make sense of all of those things as if we live as these entirely coherent singular beings who have very concrete and set ideas of ourselves and who we are, and so on.
Also, life history is also a potential archive to understand how individual memories connect with collective memories, and also the ways in which something like trauma and other human conditions are handled in a very specific way. I think no other form can give you that, I think. That's my hunch.
Yeah, I think that's probably right. I mean, it would be a hunch for me too. Certainly for people who have been affected by leprosy, who have been through what you might describe as a trauma, or it might be described in some other way. But people have had very specific experiences going through that. And I think there was a sense of catharsis in being given an opportunity to talk about those, and to talk about them also in a way that went beyond these kind of set synoptic kind of stories that people told about themselves. People often have to tell their whole life history very quickly for researchers. It gave people a chance, I think, to unpack their feelings at various different points along that trajectory, given that leprosy wasn't the only thing in their lives, and it needed to be understood in relation to all sorts of other things that were going on as well, whether these were these big historical events, like the emergency in the 1970s, like assassinations of various
big
prime
leaders.
ministers,
Yes.
Like what was going on in the World Health Organization and their policies and those sorts of things. Their lives were all playing out against these backdrops. And I think, certainly speaking to Das subsequently, I think it helped him also to make sense of things that had happened to him over that period, being given that opportunity to talk about it in that, enormous depth. I probably know more about his life than I could tell you about my own, actually.
I know. I can see that in that book, actually. Perhaps I would say I can feel that, because you also bring in your preface to the book on the leprosy, Job Das's personal life history. You bring in the idea of dwelling perspective. In a way, you preferred. So suppose he says, "I grew up in this village," then you would take a train or bus and go there and see how Tanjavur, unpacks itself. At least 30 years after his childhood, and then somehow wait for a time when his memory triggers about his childhood, and everything else is coming up because it is a dwelling perspective. Citing Ingold, is it? An anthropologist. Yeah. Can you say?
That was Tim Ingold's
thing. So can you say a little more on this idea of doing life history, and in particular, and ethnography in general?
In ethnography. So in terms of a dwelling perspective.
Yeah.
I suppose it's a kind of philosophical idea in the way that Tim Ingold presents it, which I think is about overcoming that separation that we tend to make between human beings and the spaces and places that they inhabit. And for me, it was about recognizing that place, is important, that we're not these bounded bodies that exist independently of everything else that's going on around us, whether it's the buildings that we live in, the natural environment in which we find ourselves, and so on. And I think also for me, I used it more in a methodological way, as you say, in terms of going to those places where somebody had spent time. So that with Das, for example, when he talked about being a coolie, about being a porter on Madras Central Station, it made much more sense to me, and I think to him as well, when we travelled back and sat on the benches on platform 9 or wherever it was, that he would have sat on during that period, or sat on the floor further up the platform where he ran a card school and where they played cards, with the other porters. And sitting there, being there, going under the 2 trees outside the station where the banana sellers used to sit, and so on, evoked all kinds of memories and enabled him to reflect back and talk about his life in ways that I think simply wouldn't have come out otherwise. I think he recognized that connection at a kind of visceral level between his experience and particular places and particular spaces. And I think that environment, being in that environment again, enabled those things to come out in ways they wouldn't necessarily otherwise do.
Even other interesting phenomena do emerge because of this method. For example, the idea of male flight, because of their poverty and unsteady life, they do take off to unknown places and then find a new meaning and then retrace and then find again. Phenomena of that kind also emerge because of this method, I think.
Yeah, that's true. Yes, I guess otherwise you only see isolated cases and you don't necessarily make much of them. This idea of men absconding, and once you come to look at that and get a sense of this appearing not just in his own life but across generations, something that his father did, subsequently something perhaps that his own children have done at that point in the future, and again enable me to recognize things which I hadn't necessarily seen in the ethnographic material that I already had, of women telling me about husbands who had absconded or sons who had got up on a train and disappeared somewhere. It was also, I think, something that in some ways was only possible in the past, in a time when you didn't have telephones and Facebook and WhatsApp and so on and so on. You could simply disappear in ways that it's become perhaps harder to do. Maybe not impossible still. I'm sure there are still people who do manage to abscond. But it was also a way of dealing with all sorts of other things, whether, what today we might call mental health issues, or what in the West we might call mental health issues, for which you have no other outlet. And for men, that tended to be absconding, I think, particularly in the part of village, in the village India where I carried out my research. Whereas for women, tended not to have quite those same opportunities. I think it was much harder for them because their movements were confined much more to the domestic space, or at least to the local community.
Perhaps to the kitchen,
Very often, yes.
Very often, yeah.
But otherwise, it might only have been going to the bazaar, to pick up vegetables, or within their street and their immediate neighbours. So it was harder to abscond. It was also seen as riskier. I think women were more afraid of what might happen to them. Certainly their menfolk were more afraid of what might happen to them if they were out and about on their own. So they had different ways with dealing with that. And I also did work on suicide attempts or threats to suicides, or having, again, episodes of either possession or what we again might call mental illness, which people talked about. She went pitchy, she went mad, this particular woman, where people would scream and rip their saris off in the bazaar and this kind of thing.
Yes.
It was a particularly gendered way of doing it. So yeah, I suppose linking it back to what you were talking before about this using this kind of dwelling perspective as a methodology, using life history as a methodology, in a way, doing some of that life history triggered those other things and enabled me to investigate them in ways that perhaps otherwise wouldn't have been possible, because you don't see those patterns emerging in short-term ethnography.
Yes, opening up the discussion a little wider beyond your special contributions to anthropology, maybe I would like to think this way. Ethnography is a rich visual enterprise as well, apart from listening, conversing, and being. They say a picture is worth 1,000 words, but it seems in the realms of ethnography, it may not necessarily be the case, because yes, you do give vivid observations and so on, but you do give context. But when you bring disability here, visuality and disability may have a very peculiar connection. How do you want to think about this problem, James?
I mean, do you mean in literally not being able to see?
That too.
Yes, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, in one sense, I think, yes, certainly just by looking at somebody, particularly somebody who has an invisible disability, and conversing with them, you don't necessarily get a sense of experiencing that. That doesn't come through the visual. I think in a more general sense, it comes through, as we were talking about, through being, or through intersubjectivity, for example, through spending long periods with those people so that you understand what their lives are actually like. Again, in traveling with people, for example, who were disabled through leprosy, for example, enabled one also to see particular interactions that somebody who has leprosy has with other people, the kind of reactions that they maybe anticipate or maybe get from other people, you know, when we were traveling on trains, for example, which you didn't necessarily get in the village. So I suppose in ways, I mean, some of those things were visual in the sense of observing how other people reacted and so on, which often were, those reactions were not necessarily voiced. But I think those things were also got at through that prolonged kind of encounter with somebody with a particular condition, or somebody who moves around the world, for example, with no legs, for example, and the kinds of hurdles, but potentially kinds of benefits and all sorts of other things that might emerge out of that, which don't come necessarily through seeing in a visual kind of sense, but which come through, I guess, using all of the senses at the same time, or all of the senses that one might have available to them, which might be, you know, about touch, it might be about having physical connections with people. Certainly working with leprosy patients, physical touch was very important, because many of the people who I worked with had come from communities where they'd been shunned and where people hadn't wanted to touch them anymore for feeling of, you know, for
a new form of untouchability. Yes,
a literal form of untouchability, in the sense, that people, you know, literally were, no, you know, I might catch this thing. I've got nothing against you, but I don't want to touch you. Or people who would come into the village wearing, you know, cloths over their faces, so they didn't breathe the same air as the people within that community. So I think having that physical kind of connection with people did enable a different kind of understanding, but also watching things, and again, sorry, I'm bringing it back to my own work again, but in one of the first things I wrote back in I think it was in the Journal of the Royal Anthropological Institute in 2003, was about observing that kind of intersubjectivity of, you know, we went to a place with some pagodas that I was offering to this woman who had no fingers before, and it was only my research assistant at the time leant across, he pulled them out with his own fingers, placed them into the palm of the woman's hand, you know, so that she could eat them in the particular way in which she ate them. So it was about learning those different bodily ways of doing things, and coming to appreciate that one's own bodily ways of doing things were not the ways of everyone, if you like. I'm not sure that quite answers your...
No. Very, very deeply, actually, because I'm also thinking about notions in ethnography such as gaze of the ethnographer or staring and the subtle differences that they make. Because it seems the gaze is disciplinary, and also it is a way of collecting ethnographic narratives, but at the same time it can also be judgmental. So disability, including leprosy, can invoke this kind of judgmental attitudes on the judgmental performances on the part of the ethnographer. Rosemary Garland Thompson's incredibly beautiful book on staring brings out all the subtle differences in staring. She calls it Baroque staring, which is like rogue looking, uninterrupted curiosity. So, which means in many ways we have to start thinking about ethics of visual information gathering when it comes to things like disability, simply because it is a very somebody who is not trained to look at disability can end up doing something like Baroque staring, even as an ethnographer.
Even as an ethnographer, certainly, yes. I mean, I think when I did subsequent fieldwork for a postdoc in Hyderabad, funded research, which was about disability in a more general sense. So it was about how people define themselves or how other people might have defined them as disabled, and the kind of experiences that people had of disability in a specifically Indian setting. And one of the kind of conundrums I had was that in getting informants and getting people who were going to speak to me about their own experience of disability, and was about how did one identify somebody as disabled when I was out and about, which meant looking at people's bodies in particular ways and making certain assumptions a priori that they were disabled. Of course, when one had conversations and spent time with people, you could ascertain whether they really thought they were or not. But there was a sense in it involving that original, kind of a judgment. So, you met somebody on a bus, for example, who you suddenly spotted had one leg, for example, and we would go and say hi, and if we struck up a conversation, I might add that I was doing some research on disability, and would he or she be interested in chatting to me about their experiences of it. But there was that ethical dilemma in the sense of, did this person necessarily see themselves as disabled? Certainly in one case that I spoke to, where it actually turned out that the man just had his legs bent up behind him. So it wasn't what I saw at all. But I also spoke to older people who had lost their sight, for example, who would tell me, well, no, I'm not disabled, I'm just old. And this is a feature of being old. I don't need my eyesight anymore. I have daughter-in-laws who can read the newspaper to me, who can wash my feet. It's their task now to look after me, and this actually enables me to fulfill that role as the patriarch who sits at home. My sons go out and plough the fields. The women of the household look after me. So it it enabled me in some ways to challenge those assumptions, but it also, I was in that very difficult area of how did you approach somebody? You're doing research on disability. How can you make a judgment on whether the people that you're approaching also consider themselves to be disabled? One of the ways around it, I don't think there are entirely satisfactory answers to this or entirely satisfactory ways around it. One of the ways was to work initially in institutional settings or places that people went. So I worked in an eye hospital in Hyderabad in a waiting room, where people would come in who were visually impaired or blind. Or we worked in a neurosurgeon's outpatients clinic at another hospital in Hyderabad, again, where patients would come and where the doctor himself would introduce me to these people, and I would try to get to know the families and to build up rapport that way. But yes, it was very difficult to get away from that notion of judging people initially, certainly in those first moments, by the way they looked, by the way they presented themselves. And a lot of the people that I spoke to, particularly those with cerebral palsy, parents in particular of children with cerebral palsy would tell me they didn't like going out very much as a family anymore, because they felt that their daughter was seen as, like an animal in a zoo, that people would stop and just stare. And although obviously that was not what I was trying to do, in order to engage with people with particular conditions, it did involve making particular judgments at that moment. And I suppose the only way around that was then to try, having made that judgment, was then to challenge it, or to make sure that the person to whom I was speaking and engaging with was given as much opportunity to challenge that or not. But yeah, that gaze is a problem. I think it's a particular problem as well, being a white male anthropologist coming from the West, coming from Britain in particular, coming to India, that there are already all these kind of power relations inbuilt into any kind of interactions that I have with people. Particularly if you're going to work in a leprosy colony, you're working with people who are very poor, you're seen as a potential source of funding. And I've been involved with charities working with leprosy affected people in the UK, so there is a real connection there. And I think there isn't necessarily a way around that, but I think it's something that can't be ignored. I think it's something that one always needs to factor in.
It could be a matter of training too, training in ethnography. One more thing I was thinking about was the idea in terms of intersubjectivity in ethnography, presence of disability, either on the part of the ethnographer or the participant, or both, it can introduce the notion of what Mia Mingus calls access intimacy, because given the nature of the field, it could be anything. As say a disabled ethnographer will need help. Apart from being an observer and a scholar, the person, he or she, will need help navigating. And so even the participants may themselves give information as much as assistance. And in the process, some kind of access intimacy may develop. This, I think, introduces a very special idea to ethnography. That's my idea as a literary critic. What do you think about it, James?
It's interesting. I mean, it's not something I've thought of necessarily before, and it's something which you might have, again, particular kinds of experience of. I mean, working with leprosy-affected people, as I did in my first research, that I think wasn't an issue in quite the same way, because most people were able to perform what people consider to be everyday functions by themselves. I think for the people I worked with later in Hyderabad with cerebral palsy, that was certainly much more likely to be the case, certainly among those who had the most severe kind of versions of that condition, who weren't able to do things like going to the toilet for themselves, for example, and who needed care with those things. It was also, and I guess you have that kind of intimacy that then occurs between a parent and a child, or a mother in most cases, who would be looking after a daughter or a son who needed care with their everyday basic kind of functions, whether from feeding or going to the toilet, bathing, and so on and so on. It also meant that you ended up, or I ended up very often, interviewing the parent of the person who had cerebral palsy, rather than the person who was affected by that themselves, which was problematic at various kinds of levels. But I think that one of the things that I was interested in that particular research was the way somehow that disability was lived through more than one body, perhaps. That the mother who then always needed to be on hand to do those particular things, that her life was affected in very particular ways. So I think it was also important to get those experiences of mothers, of carers, and so on. And at the same time to do that in a way that didn't negate the experiences of disabled people themselves, or simply to allow other people to represent them in ways that might not be the same as ways in which they would represent themselves. I mean, some of the people I worked with too were non-verbal, perhaps, so you couldn't interview in those conventional kinds of ways. So I think that notion, I mean, I'd like now to read more about, I think, this notion of excess intimacy. And maybe you can send me some references on that.
Sure,
James. Interesting kind of idea to pursue, but also an interesting idea through which I might critique some of my own ways of working with people.
Definitely. Well, we are almost at the fag end of the 1 hour. I can't believe that it's one.
Is it gone longer?
So I think we managed to get some things out there on disability and ethnography, particularly from your contributions, and some general discussions on ethnography. I guess we all can take it from there. Thank you so much, James. It is wonderful talking to you.
Okay, thank you, and you.
Yeah, we'll meet soon. Thank you.
Good.
Bye-bye.
Excellent. Okay, goodbye.
Goodbye.